In the nail bars, behind the closed doors of homes and hotels, the grim extent of modern slavery exposed today. 100,000 victims of many forms of exploitation. As damning as the numbers, how those victims are being failed. Especially the British children. Too often criminalised rather than cared for. Today's report suggests that too often the authorities are unwilling to believe that young British children can be modern slaves, groomed and forced into a violent world of drug dealing and criminality, which we know leaves many at risk of serious harm and for some can be fatal.
I fear that he might be dead or kill someone. That's what I fear.
For Amina's son, it began, she says, when he was groomed from the age of 13.
He was missing for 3 months, 4 months, sometimes, at his worst, he was being constantly arrested 100 miles away from home and then being found in trap houses.
Forced to stay in the often filthy homes of drug addicts, Amina says her son rarely ate and slept in his clothes. The threat of violence was constant. The idea it was a choice, laughable.
My son, I sat in front of him and he told me, who would want to do this? It's nothing glamorous, so why would somebody choose to die on the street?
Jamal was officially deemed a victim of modern slavery under the government's so-called National Referral Mechanism, or NRM, the Home Office's system for recognising victims of exploitation. It should trigger a package of help from housing to mental health support and potentially stop the child from being criminalised. Amina said it was meaningless. And what's worse, nothing was done to try to intercept the people exploiting her son. Did that make his life any safer?
No, absolutely. His life doesn't improve at all. In the first time that he was attacked, he already had a positive NRM. It's a tick-boxing exercise.
It's a view echoed in today's report, which reveals only a fraction of victims are officially recognised by government as exploited. And even when they are, not enough is done to help them. Figures show only 10% of the suspected victims of slavery were referred to the National Referral Mechanism. A quarter were British nationals. 83% of those were children.
The National Referral Mechanism just doesn't work. It doesn't work for foreign nationals properly, so many delays, and it certainly doesn't work for British victims who are worse off in the NRM because the system is set up for foreign nationals and doesn't respond well to British children. And there's a real confusion about what you do with them, but we've got to realise it and sort it out because these are the fastest growing group of slaves in Britain today.
How much is this about mindset? Convincing people that young British children, young people, can be victims of slavery?
They're young boys being forced into committing crime, and they're extremely vulnerable. These are not children making an informed choice as adults do. These are children, and we've got to do so much better to protect them.
Sam is a mother whose life has been dominated in recent years by trying to protect her son.
We were told by the police that he was groomed for criminal exploitation and that his associates were well known for extreme violence.
Henry's descent from a model grammar school boy to someone dealing drugs across the country was swift. She was desperate for the police and other authorities to officially recognise he had been exploited, forced into criminality by violence, in the hope it would protect him from harm.
I was scared that he's going to be dead any minute. And so in order for him to be seen as a victim, I needed that piece of paper for them then to trigger what should have come next. Sadly, nothing came of the NRM and the trafficking status. And my son did go on to be stabbed. I'm not aware of anybody else who's been stabbed that number of times and wasn't expected to live. The NRM process is to be viewed as a bridge, if you like, to identifying a victim and then getting them on their way to exiting whatever it is that they're involved in. And actually, they're just words. I have yet to see anybody who's had any level of a response that you could class as helpful there is just literally nothing there. Even after my son was seriously assaulted and wasn't expected to live, even at that point you would hope that something different would happen. And actually there was nothing.
So despite being acknowledged as victims of grooming and exploitation, with all the promises of help that should have brought, their sons, they say, remain in the grip of their exploiters. The women can only cling on to a desperate mix of memory and hope.
I still treasure having him sleeping on my shoulder. I'll always see the young, happy son of mine before his life was hijacked in front of all the authorities and my eyes.
Whether that exploited victim is 13 or 21 or 25, if you can see them and touch them and they're not dead yet, there is still some hope, and that's all you've got.
The Home Office today said it welcomed the findings of the report and that it would be embarking on an ambitious transformation of the national referral mechanism to make sure vulnerable victims were given the support they needed to move on with their lives.
Jackie Long reporting. Well, I'm now joined by Philippa Southwell, who is a human trafficking and modern slavery lawyer and managing director of Southwell and Partners. Also joining us is Gary Anderson. He's a former police inspector who's worked in the Trident unit of the Metropolitan Police. Let me ask you first, Philippa. The state is talking about 100,000, about 10,000 of these trafficked and enslaved minors. But the real figure, as we know from the state, from you in particular, is 100,000. Why the discrepancy?
I think that the figures that have been recorded are not a true reflection of the scale of the problem. I routinely receive referrals almost on a daily basis of British national victims who have not been identified and have been processed through the criminal justice system. And it's only once they have come through that they are identified. And we are not picking up in the first instance that these are exploited children.
I mean, the truth must be, Gary Anderson, that for the police it is actually quite a difficult problem. You've got, let's say, a rather thuggish, sort of young, tiny teenager who's peddling drugs or whatever, and the first instinct is young criminal. But then here we hear this other story, which is that they are very often trafficked and enslaved. How do you get round this?
Yes, good evening, John. Good evening, Philip. Yes, that is definitely the case, is that the police's perception is the majority of the time is they're treated as a suspect, when for the past number of years we've been trying to change that mindset so that they're actually treated a lot more like a victim. Young people in their teenage years... Sorry, John, go on.
Sorry, no, I just wondered whether you knew, whether you'd had any success in actually managing to change attitudes towards this.
It's in the early stages, 2016, 2017, we did provide training to local authority professionals and police officers frontline to basically try and change their perception of how to treat these young people. But the problem is that cycle of behaviour by frontline practitioners, both within the police and within local authorities, is very much they do treat them as criminals. And that is one of the biggest challenges that we found, is that we have to try and break that cycle of behaviour, not only by the young person, but also by the professionals trying to help and support that young person.
Philippa Southwell, it's rather extraordinary that on the day you publish your report, the government suddenly says, hey, folks, we're going to change this. We don't like the way this has been going.
I think there's been two inquiries over the last year, modern slavery inquiries, and this has been a theme: British national child criminal exploitation. And this isn't a new thing. I mean, we've seen it covered in the media. We've just seen very recent government guidance on it. It is just a new label. It is child criminal exploitation. We have seen it for hundreds of years. We are now just labelling it county lines. And I think county lines is a slightly misleading label. A lot of the young people that I represent are involved in very serious criminality. It does stem from drug running between counties, but they graduate onto extremely serious offending as a result of the debt and becoming more and more embedded into that criminal organisation. It is a real problem. We don't know what the solution is. I think one of the key things is training of professionals, and that is law enforcement, lawyers, probation officers, judges, prosecutors. I'm usually involved in cases where everything has gone wrong, and I have I sit in the position where I can analyse why was it that this young person was prosecuted and not diverted away from the criminal justice system at that first contact with law enforcement.
Gary Anderson, one of the big problems with this crime is that these kids are very often very violent, exhibiting very criminal sort of external messaging, and yet, of course, inside are exceptionally vulnerable young people. How do you get over that?
I think the main issue with young people at that age is that they don't understand how to behave within sort of society, and they are taught a lot of the time by their peers, who are their elders within it, this is how to behave. So all part of the grooming process is that they're shown violence, they're shown threats, and they just replicate that behaviour. This is how I need to act to be part of this sort of gang background. So whatever they're experiencing that firsthand from their elders, and that's why we have to try and intervene and utilise sort of teachable moments when we're actually trying to work with them to change that sort of perception of how they behave.
Philippa Southwell, do we now look back and think that the Modern Slavery Act in 2015 was the turning point, and that actually this is now a moment when the system has finally woken up?
We had for a number of years pre the enactment of the Modern Slavery Act non-prosecution, non-punishment principles, and we've had those almost back to 2009. And I've been running very successfully non-prosecution public interest arguments not to prosecute young victims who have been forced into criminality. What's new with the Modern Slavery Act is that we now have a statutory defence of slavery. The issue with that is that many victims are not identifying or don't self-identify, or practitioners do not identify them. So many of these victims plead guilty, one, because there's pressure, and two, because they are let down by the professionals acting for them. Has the Modern Slavery Act made a change? I think that one of the positive things that's come out of the Act is that there is far more public awareness on modern slavery. There is far more training. There is a lot more training that needs to be done across the whole sector, law enforcement, lawyers, probation, local authority, social services, any professional that may come into contact with vulnerable children.
Philippa Southwell, Gary Anderson, thank you both very warmly. Thank you for talking to us.